not an expert in this stuff. So I'm definitely an expert in the history of Eastern State Penitentiary. I can tell you some broad things. John and I were talking a little bit at intermission about some of the themes that are interesting. Has anyone here ever been to Eastern State Penitentiary, by the way?
Yes.
A couple people, thanks for coming. Eastern State Penitentiary is a historic site in Philadelphia now. It was a prison that opened in 1829 in Philadelphia, and in its day was one of two prisons that set the model for the way prisons were designed all over the world in the 1800s. Almost all prisons in the world were modeled after either Eastern State Penitentiary or after Sing Sing in New York. Eastern State was called the Pennsylvania system, and prisons modeled after Sing Sing were called the Auburn or the New York prisons. And one of the things that's interesting in the play to see was the way that this idea of this capitalist approach to running the prisons and trying to make money off the prisons. The Pennsylvania system that was founded here in Philadelphia, with the Eastern State Penitentiary, did not use the inmates as a labor source. Inmates were taught a skill they could practice by themselves, but inmates were housed in isolation. Both of these two systems, the New York system and the Pennsylvania system, both were designed with the belief that the inmates had to be kept away from one another if they were going to be rehabilitated. And so the New York prisons allowed the inmates to work together in silent groups, and the Pennsylvania system physically separated them from one another. The period of the play is 80 years later or so, and the idea of trying to turn a profit. Those New York prisons, because they allowed the inmates to work together, end up being profitable, and private industry would come in and run factories. Sing Sing itself had a huge factory run by private industry, and even though the inmates were sort of ostensibly supposed to be getting rehabilitated through the silence of the prison discipline, so they were supposed to be, spending this time reflecting on their crimes. In fact, they were working all day in these big factories, and of course they were a very inexpensive labor force. The play is 80 years later or so, and further south, and these chain gangs, obviously, everyone's familiar with the kind of shameful history of the chain gangs and the prison labor in the South. I don't know much about what was happening in Virginia. Further south, in the deep South, they had enormous work crews all the way up through the early 20th century. There's a big prison in Louisiana called Angola, or the Farm is its nickname, and it was a former slave plantation that kind of kept running. They went from one to the other, and almost this seamless shift. Essentially, it changed the way the money was flowing, but it was still a for-profit industry now with inmates, often on very thin charges, running this enormous plantation. It was interesting to see the way that the warden himself was portrayed in the play. It was something that really surprised me when I first began talking to prison officials and corrections officers. How many good-natured people there are who work in prisons, even some of the officers who, when I first started working this kind of business, I assumed that all the officers were going to be just these horrible people, and that you get this image of the way the prisons are run. And there's a lot of people who come out of social work and end up in prisons. Although, especially in this period, sometimes they were highly ineffective. So this dichotomy of seeing a warden who talks a pretty good game about trying to rehabilitate the inmates without much control over the men who work for him certainly rang true for what happened at Eastern State. I brought a couple photographs here of Eastern State, just right over here. It has this distinctive wagon wheel floor plan, and is a model for about 300 prisons around the world. So, let's see here. I'll show you one more thing real fast. Later became it was open for so long, it was open for 142 consecutive years. So while it's one of the oldest prisons in America, it survived up until 1971. It was still in use. So things like playing baseball. A lot of these spaces are now open for visitors if you want to come visit. I don't want to belabor this, and I actually would love to hear what some of you guys have to say. So I did I have some passes for Eastern State, just a few, and I have some brochures. And I'm guessing that some people in the audience might want to ask some questions of the actors or of John. So, or of me, I'm happy to answer questions as well. Do we have any questions about Eastern State or this period in prison history? was mentioning something that I thought was fascinating that I hadn't thought of and I wouldn't have noticed. But the way that the actors were used in the play, the same actors who were, the warden was also the more passive of the prison officers, and then the capitalist was the more aggressive of the prison officers, and that was intentional. I thought it was fascinating. And it would have been a really smart casting call, and we could have taken credit for it.
Never steal from the playwrights, certainly not. Just notice what he did.
Pretty neat.
Do prisons go to their maximum capacity?
Do prisons?
Yeah, do they put the maximum amount they can get in there, or do they keep it down for
Question was, do prisons go to their maximum capacity? And almost invariably, the trend is to overfill them. That was certainly the case at Eastern State. It had this very simple idea of housing prisoners in isolation, and they overfilled it almost from immediately. It was overcrowded within 6 or 7 years of its construction. And so it forced them to compromise all sorts of aspects of it. And that seems to be the case universally, worldwide, throughout time, that if there's a prison cell somewhere, there's going to be a legislator somewhere to find someone, a body for that cell. So it's very, very unusual to see prisons. Not that it never happens, but it's unusual. A lot of states now are shipping their prisoners to other states because they don't have the capacity within their own states. Pennsylvania is accepting inmates from other states, but a lot of states have to ship their inmates elsewhere because they just don't have them. California, for instance, just doesn't have enough beds.